Hello, everybody. Sorry, I'm just adjusting this. I am Mercedes Wilson. I think I've met everybody here now. If anybody is watching online, hi, nice to meet you. Thank you for joining us this morning at the Door Covenant Church. Pastor Jack has this popular saying, you guys probably all know it, that we are an imperfect church for imperfect people. And that is why I love it and enjoy coming here and enjoy fellowshipping with everyone. So today the topic that I'm discussing is obscurity. And that, as I mentioned earlier, that's something I've actually more recently kind of wrestled with and struggled with in my life. I'm not sure what makes me qualified. I have all these doubts and I just feel so obscure, so insignificant in light of God's glory and his kingdom. And I kind of ask myself, well, what is my role in this? And why would I be given a role? Why would God choose me? And I think that's what I'm going to be discussing and kind of what happens more in our obscurity. What happens during that time? We have a lot of people in the Bible, a lot of examples of that. So to kind of give a definition of obscure. One definition is that it's not discovered or known about, and another definition is that it's not important or well known. That's just a couple of definitions to think about as I'm talking about this. That's kind of the way that I have been defining it. So I've kind of been learning that I'm also not the only one who sometimes feels obscure or insignificant. And as a stay-at-home mom, sometimes I feel like left out or excluded from some of the camaraderie that I used to enjoy when I was working. Sometimes it can be a little bit isolating, especially as a stay-at-home homeschooling mom. And then, if I'm being really honest about that, being a stay-at-home mom can sometimes feel, or being a mom at all can sometimes feel like I'm reduced to how my kids act. So my role as a mom sometimes feels a little bit like, oh, if my kids are acting right, then I'm a good mom. But if they're not acting right and they decide to throw a very public, dramatic, Emmy award-winning, Oscar Globe-winning tantrum in Costco, that I am suddenly a bad mom. When I worked, I would occasionally feel unimportant, overlooked, or just like a cog in the machine. However, there's many humble beginnings in the Bible. The birth of Jesus in a stable, in a manger. Moses, who was a murderer, fled for his life from Pharaoh to Midian, where I can't remember if he was herding, I think, goats or sheep, he was herding some type of animal, and he was just kind of obscure and not well known. And then there was David, who was tending sheep when he was called last from the field to go home when Samuel came to approach his father about bringing all his sons before him so he can anoint the one who the Lord tells him to anoint as king. And then Esther, she went from being an orphan raised by her cousin to becoming queen and saving her people. Countless examples, and I could go on and on. One big thing that I consider when I'm looking at myself and looking inward at, oh God, I'm just so obscure, I'm so tiny. I'm considering the Great Commission. So Jesus told us to go out into the nations and preach the gospel, make disciples of all nations. It's us, it's all of us. It doesn't matter what we think of ourselves or what our stature is or how important or unimportant we think we are. But at times, this Great Commission seems like a really big, insurmountable task. From where we're standing, from our own perspectives, right? Especially with today's political climate. And I don't know if your mother ever told any of you this, but sometimes I've heard, don't discuss religion or politics, which is like in direct contradiction to what we're supposed to be doing as Christians, right? Jesus said, spread the gospel. It's not something we clam up about. That's just a side note, sorry. um, but something I've struggled with in the Great Commission is I just feel so insignificant. Who am I to, share this news with people? Who am I to, kind of relay all this? Do I need to travel to some foreign country to be able to do this? I would challenge you guys to start right here, right where you are. We don't need to go to third world countries. We don't need to travel to foreign countries to spread the gospel. We can start right in our own proverbial backyards. Other times, it's not our own significance that we question, but it's just the task of everyday life. I don't know if anyone has ever seen a lifestyle blog or seen these families that just kind of take their phones and they walk around taping themselves, recording themselves all day for YouTube. My kids seem to like watching those, and it's pretty interesting to me that they would enjoy watching that because I find it a little bit boring. They're doing all these mundane tasks like going to the doctor or going to the dentist or washing dishes, and they're just narrating the whole thing for all the world to see on YouTube. And somehow they make millions of dollars from this. I have no idea how. But if you were to follow me around, I guarantee you would be bored. My life is mostly mundane, and I would think that for the most of us, we kind of have these everyday routines, and we get lost in that, and it kind of becomes, it's just so mundane, and we kind of forget that we're still called in that. So you might ask yourself, in the light of doing these everyday tasks, doesn't this seem too small and insignificant to really be making a difference? So what I'm talking about here is when we think about our routine and we think about, my role is just to do this. And I think we kind of miss out on the bigger picture and the bigger, it's just one piece of a puzzle in this great tapestry that God has woven for us, and we kind of don't see that we do have a very major, significant role in that. Zechariah 4:10 says, "Do not despise these small beginnings, for the Lord rejoices to see the work begin." It's okay to start from wherever you're at. In fact, where else would you start? Small beginnings are not a bad thing. It's a starting place for growth. It's God's protection while we grow. It's like obscurity. One of the definitions I think I covered was to obscure something means to cover something. So it's like having God's covering over us while we develop and grow spiritually. So I'm going to jump back to David, and we're going to go a little bit more into his story. So David, as he went from being a sheep herder to anointed as king, to conquering Goliath, he didn't immediately make the jump from being anointed by the prophet Samuel to moving in the palace and having the golden chariots and all the wine and whatever. He went back to being a sheep herder, and that was even before conquering Goliath. After Saul became jealous of David, Saul was the king at the time. David didn't just take over control and move into the palace. No, he had to go on the run and into hiding. In 1 Samuel 16:11, we see that his own family regarded him as so small and insignificant that they didn't even bring him into the house to be anointed by Samuel, and Samuel presented himself for that. No, all of David's older brothers stood before Samuel, and Samuel's talking with God, saying, surely the one that I'm supposed to anoint is before me. Surely he's looking at each of the brothers. They're big, they're strong, they really got it going on. And Samuel's like, come on, this has got to be the guy, right? And God says, no. He says, in 1 Samuel 16:7, he said, but the Lord said to Samuel, do not look at his appearance or at his physical stature, because I have refused him. For the Lord does not see as man sees. For man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. So David, even then, we find out that David does get anointed by Samuel, but he goes back to being a sheep herder after being anointed to be king, which we would expect some big coronation and celebration, right? He's going to move into the palace, take over, he's going to be king, right? No, he goes back to being a sheep herder. But we do learn later on in Samuel that as David is preparing to fight Goliath, right? He gets sent out by his dad to go visit his brothers, and all he's supposed to do, it's like his dad calls him in from the field and says, David, I need you to take this, these Lunchables or whatever, and go give them to your brothers at the battlefield there. They're probably starving. So David's like, all right, cool, Dad, I'll go do it. So he brings this lunch to his brothers, and he learns about Goliath, who's this Philistine. And Goliath is taunting Israel. He's just hurling insults. If your God was so real, why are you so scared of me? And blah, blah, blah. And David says, not on my watch, buddy. And you have to remember, David is actually pretty young when this happens. So he's kind of withstanding doubt on both sides. He's got his brothers being like, oh, you're just a little kid, you just came up here to give us our lunch. What are you trying to yell at us for, about Goliath? And eventually David goes on to fight Goliath. But even then, he gets hit with mockery from Goliath right away. Goliath says, he sees David with his stones and his slingshot. I'm imagining it was made with sticks, because Goliath says, am I a dog that you would come at me with some sticks? Like, what are you doing? So there's a lot of obscurity there, but what we learn is that David was being prepared for this moment when he was out in the fields herding sheep. Because when he's talking to them, when he's justifying, he's saying, send me, I'll go fight this guy. He can't mock us. He can't mock our God and get away with it. Like, you guys are just going to hand over the victory to him, are you? So he's exalting them. He's extorting them. Like, why? Just let me do it. And they're like, you're a kid. What are you going to do? But he tells them, he says, when I was herding sheep in the field, I had to fight off a bear. I had to fight off a lion. And not only that, but I smoked them. I killed them. So he was being prepared during that time in this mundane task of herding sheep. He was being prepared to conquer Goliath. He was being prepared to be king. So while we might feel obscure and insignificant, I think it's clear that as we walk with God through our humble beginnings, through our small beginnings, that's when he's developing us. That's when he's maturing us. So that's when our spiritual walk is, we're able to grow in him. Now, talking from a personal experience, when I became a stay-at-home mom, it felt like the biggest leap of faith, and I felt like I was starting life all over again simultaneously. It felt like I was trading in financial security and a lot of my identity, because I had like my identity wrapped up in being like this stellar employee and whatever I was trying to do. I felt like my self-worth came from whatever my boss had thought of me. So I felt like I was kind of trading that all in. And on top of that, I didn't really have a ton of supportive family. So it felt like I was doing something wrong, and I had to face things like, oh, you're this will not be good for your family, and just whatever. It was a lot of doubt, and so I began to kind of, I'd already struggled with doubting myself, but then to have that kind of piled on was like, wow. And I even had some friends that didn't quite understand, and it felt really isolating. So I questioned a lot of times if I was doing the right thing. And I wondered if that's what God was really calling me to do. I felt like I had maybe some sort of status or stature working where I worked in my role versus being just a stay-at-home mom, which is silly now when I think about it. But to me, then it was a big deal. In 1 Corinthians 7:20 through 24, I found a lot of hope, and it really reassured me when I was kind of looking into, what am I supposed to do? Am I just really this insignificant, obscure person? And how do I start doing these things? And where do I start heeding God's call? It said, let each one remain in the same calling in which he was called. Were you called while a slave? Do not be concerned about it, but if you can be made free, rather use it. For he who is called in the Lord while a slave is the Lord's freedman. Likewise, he who is called while free is Christ's slave. You were bought for a price. Do not become slaves of men. Brethren, let each one remain with God in that state in which he was called. So I'm going to repeat parts of this because this is what really helped me when I was confused. Let each one remain in the same calling in which he was called. So when I was feeling like I was trading in whatever status, worldly status I thought I had to become just a mom, just a full-time mom, I was also questioning, can I somehow use this? What is God calling me into? What is he trying to use me for? So that really helped me. I'm supposed to be where God calls me, be fully present. This is where I'm called. So Paul is warning us not to worry about making immediate, drastic changes for the wrong reasons. Growth in our spiritual lives, in our calling, takes time. So for me personally, it meant finding the significance in my role as a mom. Even the mundane tasks like loading and unloading the dishwasher and telling the kids to pick up their shoes for the millionth time, hang their coats up. Instead of whatever grand, Pinterest perfect adventure I thought that I'd be living. The second part of the verse that I wanted to point out was, you were bought for a price. Do not become slaves of men. So obviously, there's a couple different ways we could go with that. I think when Paul is talking about do not become slaves of men, I think what he's really talking about is, are we looking at ourselves and trying to improve try to fix our outward appearance so that we're going to be more acceptable to other people, that we're going to gain more notoriety or accolades or whatever. We're going to make ourselves more known to other people instead of just walking with God in whatever obscure, insignificant thing that we feel. But I feel like God accepts us not because of whatever worthiness we think we have, but because of his grace and his love and his mercy. If our humble beginnings produce in us a drive to somehow appear as better than one another or as more than one another, we have to ask ourselves if we're really growing in God's grace or growing in our ego and sprinkling some scripture on it. We cannot appear more worthy to God or sacrifice things that he doesn't ask us to give up in order to earn his love. So sometimes I think that I myself had gotten wrapped up in how can I, appease God and sacrifice things that maybe he didn't call me to give up. And it's easy to take on that attitude of a martyr and maybe start to resent choices that we had made, not fully realizing that we had done that on our own accord and it wasn't something that God had called us to do. So we can live with growing in maturity spiritually and be feeling insignificant and not knowing what our role is, not knowing what God's call is on our life, but know that we're being covered, we're being protected. We have that grace, we have his love, and we can grow in that. And we're all going to have a role that is probably different than what we thought it would be. And that there's nothing too small or too insignificant that God would tell us to do that to him doesn't mean something much bigger, even if we don't see it. So we wonder sometimes if we should be doing more. As I mentioned earlier, most of my daily routine seems insignificant and mundane. Nothing special or impactful, nothing newsworthy, nothing, worth posting on Facebook or Instagram or whatever social media. But I have a sneaking suspicion that I'm not the only person who sometimes feels that way. I get tangled up with that a lot. I guess 6:8 says, he has shown you, O man, what is good. And what does God require of you but to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God? Let's think about that. It might seem mundane to do these things, to love mercy, walk humbly, and do justice. And I think we all have to ask God, what does that look like in my life? And really listen to that. Because wherever we're at in life, we don't have to be on a stage. We don't have to be, doing whatever. We don't have to be famous people or what do they call them? Social media influencers. We don't have to get to this huge platform to follow our calling and to grow spiritually and to grow in whatever God has called each of us to do as individuals. So we can start from right where we're at, and we don't have to feel like, oh, I need to appear like I'm bigger. So to recap, humble beginnings, we don't need to frown upon them. There's countless examples in the Bible of insignificant, unexpected people rising to God's calling on their lives to believers today. We learned that we can start where we are, trusting that God's plan for our lives is bigger than we could ever imagine. Don't let small or humble beginnings or starting over keep you from walking the path that God has laid out for you. There's no beginning too small. It doesn't matter how insignificant or obscure we feel. We have to remember that God's got his hand on us, that sometimes that obscurity is a good thing so that we can develop and grow in maturity spiritually. Yes, during this time that he protects us. So thank you all. That is all I have for today. I'm going to close us out with a prayer, and then we can get going, I guess. All right. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for bringing us together today. I just pray that you help everyone here today, and even everybody watching online, with their calling. And if they're feeling really small and insignificant, Lord, or if you ever battled that, I just pray that you would help lead them out of that and help them mature and grow spiritually and really show everybody which path they're supposed to be on, and help us, remind us not to despise these humble beginnings or these starting overs as we sometimes do in life. Um, Really just guide us, Lord, and bring us closer together. Help us have conversations about this so that we can all grow together. In Jesus' name, amen.